Thanks, Susan, who also, I didn't get my talk title submitted in time, so I like yours much better than mine.
I gave it the title.
Yeah. Although it might take a more morbid meaning when I get to my results section, unfortunately. But you are the first formal audience that I'm presenting these results to in a formal setting, so I am looking forward to seeing what conversations are sparked from this. So I'll breeze through this since Laura had these same figures in her talk, the first talk of the day. But stocking in Lake Michigan is one of the primary mechanisms we have to get us towards our rehabilitation goals. And stocking has been pretty consistently high since 1965, hovering around 2 million fish stocked annually. And if you draw your attention to the more recent years, that's primarily a mix of 3 genetic strains, the Huron-Parry Sound, Michigan Lewis Lake, and Seneca. And this again is the stock assessment units, which are one tool used to evaluate the success of stocking since we do put such a high investment into it. And more or less each of the stock assessment units is able to output the total lake trout population size, or the estimate, which allows us to assess progress towards rehabilitation and ultimately inform management. Given our reliance on these models, it is very important to make sure that our inputs into these models are as accurate as possible. And one particularly important input is the juvenile survival metric from age 1 to 2. So the hatcheries do raise the fish until they are 1 year old so that they are larger and more robust when they're stocked. However, they are still vulnerable to predation at that age. And ultimately, that survival after the yearling stage determines how many of those fish will ultimately recruit to the adult population. The number that's currently used in most of the Lake Michigan models is 60% mortality from age 1 to age 2. That comes from a study from 1990 by Rybicki et al. And this is a figure pulled from their paper. They conducted their work in the west arm of Grand Traverse Bay. And they, along these transects that are shown here, doing bottom trawl surveys for 10 successive days, and ultimately making those mortality estimates at the population level. The current study is going to use acoustic telemetry methods, which is often thought of as a tool for assessing movement, but is increasingly used for mortality estimation. And I should mention that the impetus for the current study really came as a charge from the modeling subcommittee to get a more updated metric since it's currently based on that 1990 work. And we want the updated metric to better reflect modern stocking practices and current environmental conditions. So in our study, we used predation tags specifically. They look very similar to regular tags. They come in a variety of sizes, as is shown here. But what makes them unique is they have a polymer coating, which will actually start dissolving when the tagged fish is eaten by a predator. And from that point forward, a sensor value is inputted. So when that fish is detected on a receiver, it allows you to know not only that they were predated, but approximately when. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, and is a really cool technology that Innovasi started, just hit the shelves in 2017. So the first step in determining our methodology was deciding which stocking site we were going to look at, and we ultimately settled on High Island Reef within the Northern Refuge, so that red square shows that approximate area. And we chose this in part because it complements the adult movement work that Tom presented on earlier, and there was already a large receiver array deployed there that we could leverage. In August of 2024, we deployed 47 additional receivers, which are shown with the yellow triangles there. So where they're most dense, right at the southern tip of High Island, is right at the reef summit where the fish were stocked, and then they become less dense as you radiate out from that point. And the following spring, we tagged 90 fish, so we surgically implanted V7D predation tags into those 90 fish, split equally between the 3 strains that are stocked at that site. We allowed for a 3-week monitoring period during which all of the fish survived and seemed to be swimming around their tanks relatively normally, or normally, not relatively, which was a promising sign. 2 of the fish did die in the transport process out to the stocking site, so that left us with a sample size of 88 fish. Both of those that died were the Seneca strain. So I was fortunate to be able to ride along with the stocking crew and take some underwater footage. So this is kind of the chaotic frenzy as 40,000 fish were released at the first drop point. And then just a couple minutes prior, this was the release of 30 of the tagged fish. So it's definitely a good sign to see them looking and swimming around normally right off the bat. So 4.5 months later, we picked up the receivers and downloaded those data. So what I'm going to present today is from May through September. However, the tag life is 227 days. So when we get the receivers again this summer, I'll have data for an additional 3 months and can look at what they were doing over the winter. So after the release event, I did follow them down to the bottom of the lake and saw some pretty interesting behaviors. This was at a depth, they were stocked at 3 different subsites within High Island Reef at depths between 68 and 117 feet, so moderate depths here. And this is the first behavior that I was seeing, kind of indicative of some potential stocking trauma, where they're pretty sluggish, lethargic, not moving around that much. You can see that one like right in front of the claws moving a little bit, but there are others that are not moving at all or making any attempts at avoiding my robot predator. And then the next video is a more promising sign. I was also seeing some pretty vigorous swimming along the bottom and schooling behavior and some potential predator evasion. Panning around to show you that there were other such schools. Okay, so now to jump into the moment you've been waiting for, how many of these things were actually eaten. So this chart here shows the survival probability over time with days since stocking on the x-axis. Of course, on day 0, it starts at 100% survival, but you see a pretty steep drop-off right off the bat, and ultimately this paints a pretty grim picture. By day 142, survival was at just 7%, or if you put some confidence interval around that, between 2 to 34% survival. I put the inverse of that too, so that would be 93% mortality. It can be easier to interpret the raw data, so I put that on here too. That translated to 21 out of 88 fish whose predation sensor was not triggered, compared to 67 out of 88 fish whose predation sensor was triggered. So you can keep that 76% mortality number in your head, which is higher than the 60% used in the model. Next, I looked at whether that rate differed by strain, and potentially the Huron-Parry Sound strain was predated more at 90%, but it does overlap with the other 2 strains as well, 67% for Lewis Lake and 71% for Seneca's. So they were all similarly high. In terms of the timing, I was rather surprised to see that they weren't all eaten right away. You see the first big jump between day 3 and week 1, another big jump between week 1 and week 2. Ultimately, 80% of the fish had been eaten by day 17. So a lot of the predation was happening really within the first 3 weeks, with 2 or so fish being picked off per day. Interestingly, a handful of them made it to June, one made it to July, one in August, and one was only eaten a day before I picked up the receivers on September 29th. So that's also some good validation that they could and did survive the trauma of tagging and the extra tag burden. And as for the spatial component, this map shows all the receivers they potentially could have been detected on. And then I mapped out the unique last pre-predation detections. So this is where the fish were detected right before that they were eaten. And as kind of predicted, it was mostly right in the vicinity of that stocking area. But interestingly, those 2 kind of outlier fish up there to the northwest, those predation events happened in May, so they left the area pretty quickly and traveled about 4 miles. In terms of future directions, this is a preliminary look just to get a sense of what was going on. But there's a lot more I want to do with these data. It will be really interesting to have 3 more months to look at, and then we do have funding for 2 more years of the study, so I'll be tagging 90 more fish in 2 weeks, and we're planning to do a full replication to see if we see a similarly high predation pattern this year, or if there's a lot of interannual variability with it. And then we have some flexibility as to what we want to do in year 3, whether we're looking at different depths or stocking locations, or if we want a 3rd year of replication. I do want to do some more detective work to see who the most likely main predator is. And one way I can do this is by looking at the detections, the post-predation detections. If there's a lot of wide-ranging, faster movement, that could be more indicative of lake trout. And if they're sticking around the area, that could be more indicative of burbot. I focused on the predated group today, but there is a lot that can be learned from those 22 survivors or potential survivors. I'm interested in where they moved, how far, and what might have been driving that movement. And finally, I wanted to mention that this is a collaborative effort. We are sharing GLERI funding amongst 3 of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offices. We all have slightly different goals, but ultimately are all tracking post-stocking outcomes using predator tags with hatchery-reared lake trout. And they do have some preliminary results as well, which I will show on the screen here. So the Alpena office in Northern Lake Michigan found lower predation rates than we did, 42% for Huron-Perry Sounds and 58% for Senecas. And the Lower Great Lakes office, they tagged only Senecas, and instead their treatments were depth. And they are potentially seeing higher predation in the shallow stocking sites compared to the deep stocking sites, with 70 and 59% predation respectively. And last but not least, there is a published paper by Alex Gatch that came out in 22 that I've poured over in designing this study. They tagged the Lake Champlain strain and found a lot lower predation or mortality than we did at 26.3%. They did not use predation tags though, so there was a lot more inference as to what the outcomes were. And I know Alex is giving a talk on Thursday. So thank you for your attention, sticking with me until the last talk of the session. Thank you to all the collaborators here, and happy to take questions and discuss throughout the week.